Alright guys, welcome back to On the Grid, and today's video, what I wanted to do is kind of create more of a reference video for settings to all your Fanatec wheels. I know when I've gone out and bought a wheel or bought a new racing sim, I've always kind of wanted to find a good set of settings that I can start out with. Now the thing is with force feedback settings, there really is no best settings, so to speak. It really is a personal thing, and it's going to vary from game to hardware to the way you drive, the type of style you drive, the type of force feedback you like. And so what I wanted to do is just kind of give you a good baseline of settings that I feel personally for me work really well, and what I've, after many hours in each of these sims, have come to get these settings to a point where I find really good and really happy with. So before we get into the settings within each sim title, just keep in mind that if you're going from a DD wheel to a Clubsport wheel to a CSL Elite wheel, not all these settings will be implemented. So for example, like linearity, interpolation, inertia, and friction, those things will not be available on the Clubsport wheel or the CSL Elite wheel. So when I'm going through them, I'll just basically mention the force feedback and the drift mode settings, and vice versa. On the DD wheel, there's no drift mode. So just keep that in mind when we're going through. And all right, let's go. So we're going to start with Assetto Corsa. Under the advanced panel, really a lot of these settings here that you see, filter, minimum force, the effects, I usually leave them off at 0 because you really don't want to enhance anything. Depending on the type of wheel you have, if you're running a direct drive wheel, for the most part, you want to keep these at 0. So my gain, you can see it's at 70% and everything else is shut off. What you do want to make sure of though is if you're running a Fanatec wheel is you have the inverted unchecked, the understeer effect, and the update rate. Just make sure those are all unchecked as well. Yeah, so I mean, quite simple. And here on the side, I'll put up my settings, and on my settings, I have my steering maximum angle at 1080, which is proper for Assetto Corsa. My force feedback strength in game, as you see, is 70. On my wheel, I have it set at 36. My linearity, I have it disabled. The natural damper, I have it at 20. Natural friction and inertia, I have them both set at 0. The interpolation, I have it at 3. And, in Assetto Corsa, you can pretty much dial this right down at 2 or 3. You don't need, there's not really any of these sharp spikes that you see in some of the other games, some of the other titles. So really you can keep that quite low and get as much detail out as possible. The force effect intensity, I have that set at 80. And then game force, spring, and damper, I have it set at 100. But the spring doesn't have any effect, so it really doesn't matter whether you have that at 100 or not. Yeah, and then the other thing is my vibration shock, I have it set at 80, and that's only effective on wheels that do have vibration motors in the steering wheel. So that would be like the Formula wheel, the Formula V2 wheel, the BMW wheel, and the Porsche 918 wheel. Those ones do have vibration motors in there. My braking force, I have it set at 75. So really happy with these settings. If you're running the CSL Elite, or if you're running a Clubsport wheel, then you'll probably want to increase your force feedback. And the only other thing would be your drift mode. So I would say on the Clubsport wheelbase, like say 2.5, I would do maybe 1 or 2, a minus 1 or 2. And on the CSL Elite base, I would go up to maybe 2 or 3. All right, so let's move on to Assetto Corsa Competizione. In Assetto Corsa Competizione, let's go into options, we'll go into controls, and you'll see again, much like AC or much like Assetto Corsa, it's very simple and very straightforward. In the game, I have my gain set to 60%, minimum force, dynamic damping, and road effects all at 0. With a direct drive wheel, you don't really need to enhance any of that, so you can leave those pretty much at 0. My steering lock, I have it at 1080, and steering linearity at 1, the brake gamma at 1, and the gear shift debouncing at 50 milliseconds. So on my wheel settings for ACC, I have it set to maximum steering angle at auto, which will allow the game to dictate the degrees of rotation. You see I have my overall force feedback strength at 45, so 60 in game, 45 on the wheel. Linearity disabled, my natural damper at 20, and natural friction and inertia, again, I have those set to off. The interpolation, I have it set to 4. And I've kind of been playing back and forth, going up and down with that, so I think I've settled pretty much at 3 or 4. The force feedback intensity at 90, my force, spring, and damper, all 3 of those at 100%. My multi-position switch, if you have a wheel that has a multi-position switch like a Porsche Podium wheel, a Formula wheel, when you have the multi-position switch, I have it set to constant, which I find is what works the best in ACC. And my brake force, I have it set to 40. Now, the reason I have my brake force set to 40 here, just to explain really quickly. So with your braking force, the higher you increase that number, the more you're required to press the brake to get full lock. If I set that to 90, 95, I'm going to really have to put the pressure down on the wheel. Whereas if I lower it and I have it at 40, 30, 20, it takes very little pressure and the brakes will lock up. Now, why I have it at 40 is because in ACC, I use the ABS, and I think most people use the ABS. The reason I have it at 40 is because I want to enable the ABS to kick in as soon as I start touching the brake, or shortly after I put a little bit of pressure on the brake. So this way I can really just kind of feather my braking. So it really helps with your trail braking. It really helps with how much pressure you're putting on. And so that's why I have that at 40 in the game. And you'll see here I have my presets for each of my steering wheels. There's very little that I change between them. The only thing that I might change would be, increasing the gain a little bit more, or increasing the on-wheel force feedback. But this is really about my mappings. So my mappings are different based on each wheel, because the Porsche wheel compared to the Formula wheel have very different button mappings. So that is why I do that. Now, if you have a Clubsport wheel V2.5, your drift mode would probably be best to be set at -1, -2 at the most, but I would kind of settle for -1. I would increase your force feedback higher on your wheel. I would say leave it at in-game at about 60 or 70, but increase your force feedback on your wheel to say like 90 or 100, and it'll work really well. And I think, that's pretty much the only thing I would change in there. And then if you're on the CSL Elite wheel, your drift mode would probably be at like -2, I would say. And then again, obviously you put your force feedback, I would have that at 100. So that's it for ACC. Let's move on to Automobilista 2. Okay, so in Automobilista 2, again, with the force feedback settings, you have a couple of different options. One is you have your default settings, and you only have really 3 types of modifiers you can do. One is your gain, that's your force feedback strength, your low force boost, and your effects. The menu strength is really just about what's in the menu, so that doesn't have any effect on what's happening in-game when you're driving. So you really want to focus on your gain, low force boost, and effects. You also have the option to have a custom profile, which if you comfortable with it and you know how that works, you can go in and modify certain things to increase or decrease a lot of the settings like scrub and effects. So really just for the starting out, go with default, and I would have your gain set at 60, your low force boost set at 6, and your effects set at 13. Now that is if you have a direct drive wheel. If you are running a gear-based wheel, then I would definitely increase that. Put your low force boost maybe around 40 to 50, and your effects maybe at 30 to 40. You probably want to increase your gain a little bit, maybe closer to 65 or 70. But if you're running a DD wheel, these are my settings that I run with, and I'm really happy with them. I find they work really great. If we look at my Automobilista 2 settings on the wheel, my maximum steering angle is set to auto. My overall force feedback strength is 40, so 60 in game, 40 on the wheel. Linearity is disabled. My natural damper, I have it set at 25. The natural friction, I have it at 5, and natural inertia, I have it at 10. Now, the reason I have that natural friction on here is compared to AC or ACC. The wheel can be quite light in certain cars and in certain types of cars that you're driving. So by running in the natural friction, what will happen is having that set at 5, it's just going to give me a little bit more resistance in the wheel. And then having my natural inertia set at 10 is going to give me a bit more weight. So by adding a little bit of both of those, I'm getting more resistance and more weight in my wheel. The force feedback interpolation, I find it works great at 4. And the force feedback intensity at 90. You'll notice I rarely have this set at 100. It's something you can kind of tweak and adjust how you like. You might dial that down to 70 if you find there's some just really aggressive force feedback. I like it at 90. Maybe feel free to run that at 100. There's no harm in doing so. Game force, spring, and damper, I have that all set at 100 again. Brake force, I have that set at 75. So I find 75 is a sweet spot, because the one thing with AMS that I found, or AMS2 I should say, that I found is that sometimes it's really difficult to gauge what's going on with your braking because you're not getting very much information back from the game telling you like, okay, I'm about to lock up, or I'm not putting enough pressure on it. There's this really odd thing with it, and I can't figure it out. I can't pick it out, but that just having my brake force set at 75 just gives me a bit more of that range that I can play with of not locking up, but at the same time, not having to put too much pressure. So that's really why I have 75 set to that. If you are running a Clubsport wheel, then the only difference I would change again is increase your force feedback, run that close to 90 to 100, and your drift mode at like say minus, I think I have mine set at -2. And if you're running the CSL Elite wheelbase, then you're going to go the opposite. You're going to go to +2. All right, so let's go into Dirt Rally. Okay, so we're in Dirt Rally 2, and we'll just go over to the options under the input and select your wheelbase. As you see, I have the DD. We'll go into the vibration and feedback settings. And so here you see there's a few more things that you can adjust and dial in. So what I have set in game is 60 for my self-aligning torque, wheel friction at 15, tire friction at 30, and suspension at 60. I like to keep those pretty low, and the reason is because in Dirt Rally, when you're transitioning from asphalt to dirt or to off-roading, it can be quite extreme, and the differences of what you're feeling from the car and can become a little bit too harsh. So I like to keep those at like say 15, 30, and 60, and I adjust up or down sometimes. My collision at 6, the soft lock at 40, and the steering force at 40 as well. And for my on-wheel settings, I have 900 as my steering angle, and I've kind of played back and forth with this. For me, I find 900 is the best option to be running. The overall force feedback strength, I have it at 55, the linearity disabled, natural damper at 25, natural friction and inertia off. The interpolation, I have it at 6. And again, the reason I have that at 6 is to cut those sharp edges off that when you're going off-road. And that's really the only reason, because all the asphalt driving works really great. Force feedback intensity, I have that set at 90 again. That's pretty much my standard. The game force strength, I have it at 100. Spring, I have it off. The damper, I have it at 50. And again, that relates directly to what you have set as your wheel friction. So I dial that down. I don't need to have that at 100. Then after that, my brake force, I have that set at 70. If you're running a Clubsport wheel, say a 2.5, increase your strength to 100. I pretty much have your setting at 900. I would suggest that would be your best bet. And on the Clubsport wheel, the drift mode would be at say -2. On the CSL Elite would be at say 3, would be a good spot. Just keep in mind that the spring has no effect in this, so on or off, you see I have it off, but if you have it on, it doesn't matter because it actually is not even active in the game, so don't worry about that. And so that's pretty much it for Dirt Rally. Right, so in F1 2020, we'll go down here. I have a preset already set up, which is much like most of the other games. You can save a preset, and we'll just go over to the vibration and force feedback settings. So in this game, I have the vibration and force feedback set to 65. The on-track effects at 20, the rumble strip at 25, off-track effects at 20, the wheel damper at 5. And please make sure you turn off the understeer enhance. That's a canned effect, and you don't want to really add any of that to the game. Now, for my on-wheel settings, I have the steering angle set to 360. So I don't have it set to auto. I actually have it set to 360 because that is the proper degrees of rotation for the F1 cars and the F1 games especially. Now, so in game I have 65 for the force feedback. On the wheel, I have it set at 50. The linearity, I actually have it on. And what linearity does, it's actually going to limit the maximum torque if you have it enabled. So if you are experiencing like oscillations, which you can tend to get easily in Formula One, then you want to have this on, or any kind of weird odd effects, you want to have this on. The natural damper, I have it at 20, natural friction at 1, the natural inertia 2. The force feedback interpolation, I actually have this quite high at 15. And that's simply because some of the effects I find still in F1 2020 can have some really harsh feedback. For the force feedback intensity, I have it at 80. The game force effect at 100. Spring off because it actually has no effect. And damper, I have it set at 50 in-game, or on the wheel, sorry. My brake force, I do have it at 90. Now, the reason I have the brake force at 90 is because in F1, it's quite easy to lock up. So I like to have My brake force set quite high. I go between 90 and 95, but 90 I've settled at, and I find that really well. Now, if you have a Clubsport wheel, you'll want to have your drift set down a little lower, probably at about -2. And if you have a CSL Elite wheel, you could put your drift, probably be best to have it higher, like close to a 5. All right, let's move on. All right, so we're in iRacing, and this is probably one of the games that I find the most difficult to get a good force feedback, and one that I can be consistently happy with. I'm always finding that I have to be adjusting either in-game or on the wheel from one car to another, and it's just like this constant evolution of trying to get the right settings. I think I've found settings that I'm happy with and I think work across the board. There's always cases where you'll have to increase some of the strength or decrease some of the strength depending on the type of car you are driving. All right, so if we go into the drive panel, the first thing we do want to make sure that is done is calibrate your steering, calibrate your pedals and your gearbox, and make sure those are all set before moving forward. Then we'll go over to the force feedback settings, and what you'll notice is that I have mine set to maximum force. It is by default set to strength. If you click the strength, it'll actually switch over to Newton meters, and you'll be able to adjust based on Newton meters. I find it much better to run it on Newton meters than it is to run it on strength. So I have mine set to 60, which I find is a really nice balance. The wheel force, that will be the actual Newton meter strength of your wheelbase. So for example, with the DD1, it is 18. If you have a Clubsport wheel, it will be 8. And if you have a CSL Elite wheel, it will be 6. So you just adjust that and leave that set based on the wheelbase that you're using. The damping and maximum force, would leave those set to 0 or default. And there's really nothing else that you need to adjust in there. Everything else will be done on wheel. Okay, so let's go into our settings. And if you see here, my sensitivity, I have it set to 1080, which is the right setting. Auto just doesn't work for some reason in iRacing. So putting it at 1080 will make sure that you're actually getting 1-to-1 in the game. My force feedback setting here, I have it at 43. And again, I do increase that depending on some of the cars. So I go from 40 right up to 50, and I'll leave my Newton meters set in the force feedback panel, so I don't touch that. My linearity is off, and the natural damper I have it set at 25. The natural friction I have it at 5, and the natural inertia at 10. And again, that's because in the game sometimes you can feel like there's actually nothing coming through the wheel. It feels like the wheel is dead, so this just gives it a bit more detail, a bit more resistance and weight to the wheel, so that you do feel like you have some kind of force feedback. The interpolation, I have it set at 8, and that's really just because iRacing can be quite sharp in certain areas with the force feedback, so that kind of just softens it out and just rounds it off. The force effect intensity, I have it at 80, and the force, I have that at 100. Spring and damper, I have them both set to off because they're not active in the game. And the only other thing would be the brake force. I have it set at 90 because I find that in iRacing it is quite easy to lock up in certain things like the Dallara, which is a prime example of having to have the brake force set at 90. And so, yeah, that's the settings that I have for iRacing. And now we'll move into KartKraft. All right, so for KartKraft, if we just go into settings here, you'll go under input, and you'll see that if you have a direct drive wheel, you won't see the Fanatec DD wheels listed there. So you do actually have to go in and use the generic wheel and start mapping based on the generic wheel profile. If we go under the force feedback settings, they've changed this recently to where the only things you really have that affect the in-game force feedback is filtering. So minimum force is not really anything. I don't even think that's there anymore, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't checked the recent update, but for me, I have filtering and a minimum force set to 0 and the strength set to 90. And again, very simple in-game settings. There's really not much to do there. They give you most of your control. It's going to be coming from your wheel. Now, on my wheel for the DD, I have it set to 540 degrees of rotation. You will see many people talk about doing it at 180 or I believe not 360, but I think it's 180 or 160 if I'm not mistaken. But I've tried it at that. I just find it really difficult to control the car at that steering angle. So the maximum steering angle that I set it is at 540. The force feedback strength at 45, linearity disabled, natural damper at 20, and then friction and inertia off, so 0. My interpolation, I have it at 6. And the force feedback intensity, I have it at 60. I've dialed that down quite a bit. It is a much softer force feedback, but the reason I did that is because I found that it can have some really unwanted effects coming from the game. I like that to be dialed down so I get a really nice smooth force feedback. The force and spring, I have those set at 100, and the damper I have set at 10, and my brake force, I have this set to 80 in game. As far as the CSW or the CSL Elite wheels, I don't have actual settings for that because I haven't really used those two bases on KartKraft. I've pretty much only used my DD wheel. So let's move on to rFactor 2. Okay, so we are in rFactor 2, and as you can see, this is the new beta UI menu. So where you're going to go to adjust your settings will be in this gear icon up here, and then we're going to go right over to the calibrate menu. And in here, the first couple of things I would do is just make sure your readings are all okay between your clutch, your steering, throttle, and brake, just to make sure they're, you're getting your full range for throttle and brake in case you need to reset those. For Fanatec pedals, I usually do that in the Fanatec driver window. As for force feedback, you see here the default settings are smoothing at 9. The force feedback for the specific car is at 100%. And then the steering torque minimum is at 0%. And your wheel range here is grayed out because I have it vehicle set, which means that the wheel should detect what each specific car degree of rotation is. And so that's where you would just make sure this is checked and it should work. Now, I will explain something in 1 second, but if I'm running a formula car, any of the formula cars, I usually bump this up to maybe 15 or 16. If I'm running LMPs or GT3s, I usually leave this at default 9 or 8. Now, the car-specific force feedback, I do adjust this per car. Some cars, I drop them down to about 80%, but in most situations, I leave it at 100%. So I'm not really messing too much with that. I'm not really losing any detail. And much like Assetto Corsa and Assetto Corsa Competizione, there's really very little things to adjust in-game as far as your force feedback settings are concerned. A lot of it does come down to what you're doing on your wheels. So over here, I'm going to display my wheel settings. And on my wheel, for the maximum steering range or the sensitivity, I have it set to auto. And I'm going to explain that right now. What I was mentioning before, where the degree of rotation can be kind of, there's this weird phenomenon that happens in rFactor 2. If you have your wheel sensitivity set to auto, in normal situations, it should read what the game is telling it in the specific car that you're in. So if you're in a formula car, it could drop down to 360 or 420, or if you're in a GT car, maybe 700, 900. So it'll vary, and it should read that. Now, something happens when, and I find it most times when I'm coming from another game, playing whatever other sim title, and I jump into rFactor 2, it for some reason breaks that auto sensitivity. It just doesn't work. So what I end up having to do is come over here and look at the degrees of rotation that's in this specific car and then dial that in on my wheel, which is a real pain in the butt. But I have found a way that seems to fix it. 99% of the time it does fix it before I load the game. If I'm coming from another title to rFactor 2, what I'll do is go into the rFactor 2 Steam folder and delete the controller JSON file, which is under the user profile. So I just delete that, and what you would have to do is just come over here to assign after you've deleted that controller JSON file, and then just reload your profile, your saved profile. Just make sure you do save a profile for the wheel that you're running with all your mappings and everything in here. So once you do that, you come back here, it should actually read the degrees of rotation for the car that you're in. And okay, let's go back to the Fanatec settings. So my degree of rotation is set to auto. My force feedback set to 45, linearity disabled because I don't want to limit the peak torque. The natural damper in rFactor 2, I have it at 20, but I do run sometimes at 25. Now, friction and inertia, I don't find that necessary to run in rFactor 2. I don't feel the need to have that. The interpolation, I find it works really nice at 4. You can vary between 4 and 6, but I wouldn't go any higher, and I wouldn't really necessarily go any lower. The force feedback intensity set at 90, and then the force spring and damper at 100. So the other thing is I have my brake force setting at 85. And again, I've vary with the range of that brake force setting, but I find it works quite nice at 85. So if you have a Clubsport wheel 2.5, then your force feedback, I would set it at 90. I had it at 100, but I find on my Clubsport wheel, I find it nice at 90. That's kind of like the sweet spot for me. The drift mode at -2. And on the CSL Elite wheel, you would have your drift mode probably at about 2 or 3, and then have your force feedback set at 100. Just keep in mind, though, that with the spring and damper, even though they're at 100, it has no effect in the game, so it doesn't matter if you have it on or not. And that's it for the rFactor 2 settings. All right, so in RaceRoom, this is probably one of the sims that has the most expanded settings that you can probably do for force feedback. It gives you quite a few adjustments that you can make. Now, if you look at the way the force feedback is set up in RaceRoom, this top set of settings are your general force feedback settings. And then you move down to your steering force settings. And then the bottom are your force feedback effects. So these are the enhanced effects that you get. I mean, most times you want to have these off, but there's certain things that I really like curb and shift and slip effect. I like to have those a little bit more enhanced. I absolutely love the shift effect. So for my in-game settings, I have my force feedback intensity off at 100. Now, if you're running a Fanatec wheel, make sure that you have inverted force feedback to on. And then force feedback intensity at 100, smoothing at 0, spring at 0, and damper I have a little bit, so at 5%. Now, my steering force intensity at 45, the minimum force at 0, the understeer at 20, vertical at 50, and lateral at 50. And then the steering rack, I have it set towards more of what's happening from the steering rather than from the tires, so at 30%. If we go down to the force feedback effect settings, I have my slip effect at 3%. I have engine at 0. I don't like the engine vibrations. Curb at 10, shift effect at 15, and collision at 0. And so on my wheel settings, now I've spent quite a bit of time playing around with settings on the DD wheel. And I was running, for lack of a better word, very light settings. And so I would run my force feedback, say, at 40 or 50, and then the steering force inside the game was at 45. And just kind of going back and forth, one of the devs at RaceRoom, he suggested I run completely different settings than I was running before. So dialed in the values that he suggested, and it completely changed the game for me. All of a sudden, I was feeling things that I never felt in the car before. It was like a brand new game for me. Steering angle, I have it set to auto, which works great because the game will dictate what the proper degrees of rotation for each car. You can also go in per car settings for the wheel rotation or the wheel sensitivity. You can adjust that in game. The force feedback now, I have it at 45 in game and at, I have the steering strength at a 100, but the steering force, I have it set to 45. The overall force feedback strength on my wheel, on the DD wheel, I have it set to 75, and I had it at 80, and you can run it at 80, which is, again, really good, but I found it just a bit too much. So 75, I found it was like the sweet spot. Linearity disabled, natural damper at 15, natural friction at 5, no inertia, so 0. And the force feedback interpolation at 4, the force feedback intensity at 100. The force, spring, and damper are all at 100. And keep in mind that a spring in RaceRoom is a constant centering spring effect. Now, the braking force, I do have that set at 75 because I find that is a really nice middle of the road setting and it works really, really well in RaceRoom. So these are my settings that I have for the DD. Now, if you're running the Clubsport wheel 2.5, say, for example, if you're going to run your force feedback on the wheel at 100, then you could probably leave your steering force at, say, 45 or even increase that to 50. Then run your drift mode at -2. And then on the CSL Elite, you, again, run your force feedback at, say, at 100 and your drift mode at 3. That's the settings, the only settings I would change. Yeah, in RaceRoom, I find it great because you can really enhance a lot of the little details that you want. Like, for example, shift effect. For me, the shift effect, I find it amazing. It's very immersive. If you haven't been running that before, try it at 15. The engine vibrations, I really don't like to have those, to be feeling that through the wheel all the time. So I hope you guys enjoyed this walkthrough with some of these settings. I know there's other sim titles out there, but I figured I'd want to go through the ones that were kind of the most most popular sims out there. I didn't want to do any of the arcade or the simcade games. If you feel like you want my settings for Forza or for Forza Horizon or anything like that, then feel free to make a comment in the notes down below, and I'll leave those for you. What I really wanted to do with this video was not go into detail and explain every single setting. I can do that, in another video, which will take a little bit more time. But what I wanted to do with this video is to give you a reference video to have a good set of baseline settings, both in-game and on-wheel, if you're running any of the Fanatec wheelbases. And then from there, you can start adjusting and increasing, decreasing some of the values till you get it to what you like. Now, as I said in the beginning, force feedback is a very personal type of taste. It's like each person has their own flavor of what they like. Some people like it really overblown. Some people like it really light. And so that's why I kind of wanted to give you my settings. And I've had a few people ask me, look, what settings do you run for this title or that title? So I figured, why not just put it all in one video, just take you through and have them up on the screen so you can kind of quickly reference a game that you're looking for and be able to find those settings. And so, yeah, that's it. If you want to help support the channel, please just subscribe and liking my videos. I would appreciate that. And so we'll catch you guys again soon. Take care.